Hi, everybody. I'm glad you're here. Welcome, all of you fire drill firefighters, and to those of you who are joining for the first time, welcome to the Fire Drill Fridays family, where we are building community. I love my community and learning about the climate crisis and taking action to address it. By the way, each of you can help our movement grow by sharing today's show so your friends and colleagues can join the movement. So take a moment now and hit the share button. The more people who understand the gravity of the climate crisis and are willing to act, the more chance we have to minimize it. I want to remind you of next week's movie night. I am getting so excited. Spike Lee is going to definitely be with me. We're going to be showing parts of Spike Lee's award-winning documentary, When the Levees Broke, a requiem in 4 acts about the devastation of New Orleans, Louisiana, following the failure of the levees during Hurricane Katrina. And it's going to be really fun. I've never really had a conversation with Spike Lee before, so I'm very excited. And of course, we're going to kick off movie night with a drink. I'll be making a drink based on one of your recipes. Then we're going to watch the film together. And this is next Thursday, May 27th at 5 o'clock Pacific time. And you know the drill. Go to firedrillfridays.com movie night to sign up. And before we get to today's show, time for some good news. First bit of good news, a coalition of groups, including a newly formed organization backed by actor Leonardo DiCaprio, have mobilized $40 million for efforts to restore degraded habitats in the Galapagos Islands. The initiative involves more than 40 partners, ranging from local NGOs to government to international organizations, leveraging decades of collective experience working across the archipelago. Thank you, Leonardo DiCaprio. He puts his money where his heart is. Here's the second bit of good news. Vermont greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont declined by an estimated 5.6%. from 2016 to 2019, according to new data released this week by the state, reversing several years of rising emissions. The trend is welcome news as the state presses forward on its carbon emissions reduction targets, which is legally mandated to meet. I, of course, like to think that it's as a result of my daughter's sustainable farming in Vermont, but that's just me. Since the very beginning of Fire Drill Fridays, we've talked a lot about fossil fuel racism, also called environmental racism. President Biden has outlined 4 priorities for his administration: health, economic recovery, racial equity, and the climate crisis. And we've tried to make it clear both to our audiences and to the administration directly that by tackling the climate crisis, he can address and solve all 4 at once. Because addressing climate means strengthening all of our infrastructures, our buildings, homes, hospitals, our entire healthcare delivery system to withstand the coming storms, the inevitable future pandemics, our home care, daycare, and school systems, so that the elderly and the young are protected, the workers involved are properly paid, and those workers who have to leave their parents and children in order to go out and repair our country can do so knowing that things back home are in good hands. I love the fact that President Biden is trying to explain to the Republicans in Congress and others why home care, child care, and good schools are really part of America's infrastructure. I think it makes such sense. And all of this needs to be accompanied by cleaning up and rendering safe the communities most devastated by fossil fuels. Abandoned oil wells, fracking pits and coal mines, coal ash dumps, and other toxic dumps continue to emit dangerous chemicals into the air and into the water and nearby communities, unless properly cleaned up and capped. And here's the win-win, This work has the potential of providing tens of thousands of jobs for former fossil fuel workers, and they're shovel ready. They don't have to be retrained. They don't have to learn new skills. It's a no-brainer, right? Tell that to our governor. The Biden administration has taken bold steps toward addressing the four crises, but all of the steps he's taken fall short of what's actually needed to avert climate catastrophe. And climate catastrophe means health, economic, and racial catastrophe, and democracy catastrophe, because a democracy can't flourish during catastrophe. Our goal at Fire Drill Fridays and Greenpeace is to build enough people pressure to force Biden and Congress to go further, faster. That's why I'm so grateful to those of you who tune in and help us build the movement, because we've got to build huge people power. I've learned from decades of activist experience that when you have an elected leader who listens to pressure and wants to do good, that's when you need to truly mount massive pressure campaigns. And this is what we're going to do over the coming years. And that's right, I said years, because this is a long haul campaign on a crisis schedule to save our future by cutting fossil fuel emissions. This is the mantra: cutting fossil fuel emissions in half by 2030, and then phasing them out altogether over the following 20 years by 2050. All with the ultimate goal of keeping global warming no higher than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That right there is what the science is telling us we have to do. And we must do it simultaneously by ending all the ways in which extraction of oil, gas, and coal and their transportation, refining, dumping, and burning have disproportionately harmed Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. Because that's where you find oil wells and fracking pits and leaks and toxic waste dumps and coal ash dumps and refineries and petrochemical plants. That's where they are. People of color, especially Black people in the US, are exposed to fine particulate matter pollution, which contributes to respiratory illness and death. Black Americans have more than 1.5 times the exposure to particulate matter compared to the overall population. Nearly 17.5 million people, primarily Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, live within 1 mile of an active oil or gas well. And more than 6.1 million people live within 3 miles of an oil and gas refinery. And air pollution from living in these areas is associated with asthma, lung disease, birth defects, premature birth, which is a leading cause of birth defects and early death, heart disease, and many, many forms of cancer. Pollution from natural gas infrastructure, including pipelines, drilling sites, and processing plants, has increased the risk of cancer for 1 million Black Americans. It's also contributed to 138,000 asthma attacks and 101,000 lost days of school for Black children. If completed, the proposed Formosa petrochemical plant in St. James, Louisiana, would double toxic air pollution, including the really, really dangerous benzene and ethylene oxide in the region, which already bears the nickname Cancer Alley, following decades of industrial pollution. The population of St. James, no surprise, predominantly Black. In South Texas, both fracking wastewater wells and oil and gas flares disproportionately harm Latinx communities. Latino women in the Eagle Ford Shale, the site of major fracking boom, face significantly higher risks of giving birth prematurely. This is some of the oil and gas areas. The Diane Wilson, our shrimp boat captain from last week, this is what she was talking about. This is what she was fasting to stop the dredging that would allow that oil to be exported. It's destroying their communities and their lives. She showed us that the white working class is also impacted. And as I talk about Heather McGhee's new book, The Sum of Us, I keep talking about it because it's such an important book. And what she explains so clearly in This Is and it's called The Sum of Us. And what she explains is, this isn't a zero-sum game, where if people of color gain something, white people lose. No, 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 no. Racism of all types, and especially fossil fuel racism, impacts everyone. And doing away with it helps all of us. We must know that all of us deserve a world where everyone has a good life, where our fundamental needs are met. Dignified work, good pay, healthcare, a good education, housing, clean air and water, healthy, fresh food. All of these things need to be met as a matter of course. And that we're all thriving. This is a vision that we're fighting for. And now is the time, and please understand this, because of the climate crisis, we, you and I, are truly the last generation that can achieve this. I mean, really think about it. We are the last living people that can make a difference. If we don't rise to the challenge, we will have failed all future generations, and we will have failed the planet. But we're not going to allow that to happen, are we? We are not going to let that happen. I'm going to now introduce three guests who are going to make sure that we rise to the challenge. Okay. Joseph Mcneil Jr. is a Hunkpapa Lakota, African-American member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. He is a descendant of Sitting Bull through his mother, and his father is one of the original members of the 1960 Greensboro 4 sit-in movement in North Carolina. If you want to see the power of courageous civil disobedience, I urge you all to Google the Greensboro 4 sit-in movement in North Carolina. Joseph Mcneil serves as the general manager of SAGE Development Authority. He's president of Standing Rock Development Corporation, manager of Rock Industries Corp., and chairman of the board of the Oyate Community Development Finance Institute in Fort Yates, North Dakota. My second guest is Tim Donaghy. He joined Greenpeace USA research team in 2014. His research has focused on climate change and energy policy, with a particular focus on the oil and gas industry. Before joining Greenpeace, he investigated political interference in science with the Union of Concerned Scientists and worked on sustainable development projects while living in Nigeria. And my third guest, welcome back to Fire Drill Fridays. I think Colette has been a guest 2 or 3 times, and Colette Pichon Battle, Esquire, is the founder and executive director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, and develops programming focused on equitable disaster recovery, global migration, community economic development, climate justice, and energy democracy. Welcome back, Colette, and welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about fossil fuel racism and what we can do about it. And I have so many questions. I'm going to start with you, Tim. What is fossil fuel racism? And is it different from environmental racism?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Really excited to be on the show today. So fossil fuel racism has to do with the fact that fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, at each stage of their life cycle, like you can think of it going from the well where you extract it from the ground to the refinery to the end of their life where we burn those fossil fuels for energy. At each stage in that life cycle, they emit really toxic air and water pollution that's harmful to the health of people who live nearby. And because of the legacy of systemic racism in the United States, most of the people who live nearby who are impacted the most by this pollution are Black, brown, Indigenous, and poor communities. Those are the people who for decades have, kind of borne the brunt of pollution in this country. And so environmental racism is a broader concept, and these communities have been the ones who've really defined it and brought it into conversation because it's been obvious to them for forever that they're getting, the short end of the stick when it comes to pollution. And they've been speaking out and organizing and trying to fight environmental racism and prevent it from happening and continuing. And so fossil fuel racism is kind of just a zoomed in version where we're looking specifically at the fossil fuel part of environmental racism. So there's lots of different types of environmental racism. You can think of like the lead pipes in Flint, Michigan are an example. But there's all types of industrial pollution. It's the fact that, you know, some communities have access to nature and to green space while others don't. And that these are the reflections of past patterns of redlining and housing discrimination. So environmental racism is a very broad concept, but fossil fuel racism is narrowing its focus on fossil fuels because they are a huge part of the problem. They're extremely toxic. One of the statistics that always kind of blows my mind is that essentially every year in the United States, around 350,000 people die prematurely because of exposure to fine particulate matter pollution. You know, that's almost as much as died from COVID-19. So it's like we're having essentially a pandemic every year. And, you know, and that's just the normal operations of our economy. And like you said, you know, I think, you know, Heather McGhee's book is really fantastic. And this is a perfect example of when we're in solidarity with each other, when we try to, you know, make sure that these injustices are eliminated and we kind of can take steps towards fixing the problem, everybody benefits. Yeah. And so I really hope that people can be loud and call on Congress and Joe Biden to really end fossil fuel racism, because it's really going to lift up the whole country.
Just explain very briefly, Tim, why we know that this is not an accident, that it's deliberate.
Well, yeah, I mean, so there's been a lot of scientific studies that have looked at this question, you know, and there's, you know, it's clear that in certain cases, you know, there are deliberate sightings of things in places where there's not as much political power, political clout. You know, I don't think it's a mystery why, you know, an oil refinery doesn't get sited in, you know, right next to Mar-a-Lago. You know, that there's political power in this country, and, you know, people know that these things are toxic and they don't want it near their kids. And so pollution kind of tends to flow towards people who have been excluded from the political system, who don't have as much political clout. But it's also one of those things that, you know, this pollution is really harmful, and it is everywhere, you know, thanks to fossil fuels. So getting rid of it, you know, is really going to benefit most of us.
And what does it have to do with climate change?
Well, so we also know, in addition to causing these health harms to people who live near the industrial sites, fossil fuels are also the #1 driver of climate change. And they're what's really driving the crisis, you know, the crisis that we put off for 3 decades. And now it's coming to the fact that we have wildfires every summer and sea levels are you know, threatening parts of the country. And so what we need to address the climate crisis is that we really need to phase out fossil fuels. We need to really replace them almost entirely, you know, with clean solutions. And so it's kind of the good news, really, is that solving the climate crisis, we can actually take some steps towards solving this public health crisis that comes from air pollution, and also rectifying these patterns of past injustices that we've seen. And so, you know, we really have this kind of historic opportunity, Joe Biden and Congress, but also really the country as a whole, that we can solve so many problems by building back in a way that doesn't rely on fossil fuels and puts us on a path towards phasing them out.
Great. Thanks, Tim. And Colette, good to see you again. Because we're next week, we're going to be watching Spike Lee's documentary, When the Levees Broke. And since the entire Katrina broke levees is such a devastating example of environmental racism. Can you tell us if the levees have been rebuilt adequately in the 16 years since then? I mean, is New Orleans, especially the low-lying Ninth Ward, predominantly Black areas, better prepared for what's coming? And also Mississippi, because besides Katrina, Mississippi was really, and Louisiana, really hurt parts of those states as well. So what's happened since then?
Thank you so much, Jane. And thank you for your continued leadership and courage. You're an inspiration to all of us. No, the levees aren't ready. Unfortunately, what we're dealing with when we talk about the city of New Orleans and many, many cities along the Mississippi River that has lots of levees, not just those in New Orleans, we have to actually take a look at the standards of our government. And the standards of the government have the levees up to what's called a Category 3 hurricane. And also, they're not the same types of levees along the river. There's different types of levees. So when you get to the city of New Orleans, you're looking at concrete levees that have just been put up to the same standard that they were pre-Katrina. And what we know about climate change is that the storms are coming more, they're coming stronger, they're coming faster, and even more worrisome about those levees that go along both the river of the Mississippi and the lake of Lake Pontchartrain and many waterways down at the bottom of the state is that the increased precipitation due to climate change that we're seeing in places like the Midwest come down the Mississippi River. And so the river levels are really high for a long time. And then there's a storm. This is when we see breaches in the levee because the water has saturated the bottom so much. And then there's a storm on top of it. When we see places like Mississippi, not protected necessarily by levees, and where I live in St. Tammany Parish, not protected by levees, we see massive constructions that have been built since Katrina, seawalls and such, billions of dollars spent out there. And we've even seen in 2020 what those seawalls have been able to do to what we call a tidal surge that moves with the hurricanes. It's been able to break down the water, so we haven't had the impact that many of us were expecting, but it's also clear to us that it's not enough. And so we're really worried. I was just talking to someone today and they were saying, I'm here in Puerto Rico right now, and they were saying, is Puerto Rico ready for the next Maria? Is New Orleans ready for the next Katrina? The answer to those questions is no. And I think we've got to really get serious about what this means for those Black and Brown communities that we just heard Tim talking about, because the people in the lower Ninth Ward, while everyone just assumed they were the poorest people in New Orleans because they were Black, the truth of the matter is that redlining is what had them in that area. This was the highest percentage of home ownership of Black home ownership in the city. That area and the other part of the Ninth Ward, also called New Orleans East, this is where our Black middle class lived. And they live there because of discrimination and discriminatory housing policies. And so now when we see these climate impacts, we also see the impact of legacy discrimination. And on top of that, in places like the Ninth Ward in New Orleans East, we see our local governments trying to put more power plants in, more industrial facilities in places that we know are going to get flooded, hit, and really create not just a problem, but a toxic problem. This is what we're seeing across the board. Our governments locally and federally are not taking this seriously enough, and the sacrifice zones are being created in the South and in Black and Brown communities as usual.
We got to do something about this.
Got to do something.
We'll be down there. Fire Drill Fridays, it's our little army. We're going to come down there and raise a ruckus. Hey, Joseph, I'm so glad you're with us today. The world over, I have been just blown away by the courage and persistence and perseverance of Indigenous peoples willing to literally put their bodies on the line to protect their lands on behalf of all of us. And with the long view, the seventh generation view, and too often they've died because of it.
Right.
Your lineage is just awesome, man. I mean, Sitting Bull on one side, the Greensboro Four on the other. What's the most significant moments of activism that you've experienced in your life?
Well, Jane, I want to thank you, first of all, for allowing me the space to be here. And I want to say to my relatives, Haumitakuyapi, hello to my relatives. Ikjewichashi, hello, I'm just a common man. And I'm from the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, Hunkpapa Lakota Oyate, part of the Ocheti Shakoi. And I'm very proud and humbled to be here to talk about where we've been. Because it's important for us to understand where we've been. It gives us guidance to look at where we're going for the next 7 generations, as you mentioned. So when we look back at where we've been over the last 200 years, but let's go back 400 years, because some of the points that are being brought up, Tim and Colette are bringing up, sacrifice zones, the redlining, the original redlining that occurred in this country when the settler colonials came over here, was to exterminate and push Native people from our homelands in the east westward as the colonies were formed. And the expansion, which was actually moving and destroying Native communities and putting them in a place, was the original redlining, as slaves were brought in to increase the economy and increase the commerce, and the taking and extermination of Native peoples, our genocide that occurred here. We have to take a real look at where we've come from with a truthful lens. And what's important to realize right now is that even in today's society where we're looking at facts, there's a debate about what those facts are. And that's incredible, because we can see with a common lens, we use our heart, our human heart, that God gives us, to understand how we love one another, relate to one another as human beings. And that is where we need to take a look at where we've come from so that we can understand where we're going. We can't continue to make the same mistakes. So as we look at that, the history that we've encountered as being put on these reservations, war camps. I have a war camp number. It's called my enrollment number. And the termination and extermination of my people and my identity and races, our culture, is something that needs to be understood not just as old history, that's current and living history. Back in the 50s, when Pick Sloan occurred, when the river was dammed, the Missouri River was dammed in 5 locations, the communities were spared, but tribal communities were put in harm's way for that. So we lost all of our good bottomlands. We lost all of our good community, our hunting, everything that was important to us, we lost, while communities, Washicho or white communities, were again protected. That occurred not too long ago in 2015 and 2016 here in North Dakota, when predominantly white communities were spared the threat of having their water polluted and contaminated 10 miles north by the Army Corps and the PSC. And that was put just half a mile north of my wife's hometown. Our communities where our children swim, where we fish, where we get our drinking water, not just for Standing Rock, but Cheyenne River, Yankton Sioux Tribe, Mobridge, and 17 million people downstream. We look back at our history and see these things were built for someone's gain, for profit, not for the communities. So we have to look back at how people actually took care of one another in community, and for community, not for profit. So I feel that it's very important for us to have that perspective as we build these systems, these new systems. Stop building and reinforcing pipelines like my sister Tara out there at Line 3. She's very important to me because she's continuing.
Tara Hausa. You're talking about Tara? Yeah.
Yeah.
My friend, she's been on Fire Drill Fridays.
Yeah, she was on with us just yesterday. Her, Tokata Iron Eyes, and Ruth Buffalo were on with us yesterday on Petui Dialogues that we put on. And that's powerful voice, the female, our women, an Indigenous community, lead the fight and speak with such honor and truth, from our hearts of our people. We say that the women are the backbone of our nations, and it's true. So I'm just a man. When I get marching orders from my wife, it's what I do.
Well, I got marching orders from Winona LaDuke and from Tara. I'm going back up to Line 3, beginning of June. Maybe you'll come too, Tim. Joseph.
Oh, yeah.
Then, Tim, I want to ask you a question. I want to hear how you explain to folks why addressing fossil fuel racism is critical and must be built into all appropriate congressional bills.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really, I appreciate what Joseph has been saying about right. Understanding our history and how we got to this moment, and Colette as well. It's really amazing to look and see the redlining maps from the 1930s, which were drawn and made to, control where people could live, and that those are still the same places that have the most pollution today. It's just amazing that that's decades ago, almost 100 years ago, and it's still reverberating, and also with Indigenous sovereignty, all oil and gas extraction in the U.S. happens on land that was taken from, Indigenous tribal nations. So it's really so important, really, to kind of understand that history. But I think the COVID-19 crisis really is kind of also shown how all of our systems are connected to each other, really. Like we know that Black people, for example, have, suffered the most from COVID-19, more likely to get infected, more likely to die from COVID-19 infection. And the preliminary science is really showing, that air pollution is actually a huge risk factor. Like living in an area with a long history of air pollution is a risk factor for COVID-19. That's, the science is preliminary, but that's kind of what the initial results are showing us. So, I think there's this in Washington to try to solve problems in isolation from each other. Okay, we'll just try to zoom in and narrow in on this one particular problem without understanding that really they're connected to each other. That climate change is connected to air pollution, which is connected to healthcare, which is connected to, racial justice in the country. Need to have that sort of holistic vision. And that I think is how we should look at what Joe Biden is doing and how we should look at what Congress is doing and demand that they look at this from, a wider lens, look at it holistically. So yeah, I think we need to think about what our energy system looks like in this country and what are the ways we can push our leaders to build a better energy system so that, people aren't getting asthma, people aren't dying prematurely, and that we're rectifying these sort of past injustices.
Fossil fuels have been at the foundation of the world's economy, practically all developing nations' economy. It's woven into every aspect of our lives. Our clothes are made of plastic, which come from fossil fuels. It's so much a part of our lives and our economy. If we're going to get rid of fossil fuels, then so much about our lives, our world, our economy has to change. Let's not change that and leave racism intact and, and greed and profit intact and the hierarchy of humanity, that whole mindset intact. That's what the Green New Deal is all about, and the red, black, Green New Deal. It's about changing, if we're going to change the fundamentals of our society by getting rid of fossil fuels, let's change all of it so that in the end, we all live lives that don't kill us before our time. So Colette, you are truly at the center of all things climate justice, economic democracy, energy democracy, disaster recovery, especially in the Gulf South. Tell us, what are you most concentrated on right now? What are the hot spots for you?
Oh, and I really appreciate you mentioning the Red, Black, and Green New Deal. We launched it on May 11th with the Movement for Black Lives. And I'm just so proud to be part of a Black-led formation that's taking its guidance, not just from Black leadership, but from Black leadership on the front lines of climate change. I mean, those of us who are in the Gulf have seen the worst of this, right? The environmental justice intersection with a new climate reality. We're watching these toxic soups that are floods down our rivers. We're watching what these recovery laws and regulations look like and mean for our people. And I'm just really proud to be a part of this new project. And the goal of it is really to get more Black folks engaged in this climate conversation. This is not a conversation about environmental conservation. This is not a conversation about, just animals or a limited group of people. This is a conversation about all of that, plus racial justice, economic justice, all our future. And we really have to get more people who look like me into the conversation and part of the solution making. Part of what we're focusing on are 6 pillars of work: water, energy, land, labor, economy, and democracy. And it's these 6 pillars that we understand, if we make this stuff accessible to folks and start creating a counter narrative, because in places like the Gulf South, there is no other narrative other than the one being created by the fuel industry about things not really, climate change not really being real. You have to choose between your job and the environment, these false choices that are putting fear into people, and they're really stopping people from doing what we need to be doing to get ready for what's coming, for what is already here, and also to transition. So as you just said, Jane, so that we're not taken out before our time. We have precious lives on this earth, and we should be able to live them. And we have to understand that our economic system is rooted in a philosophy of extraction and devaluation. As Brother Joseph said, the first thing started with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. They started it and they kept it going on Black bodies and enslaved us from a continent to another continent for the profit of other people. If you really understand the philosophy of extraction, you will see how similar this is to fossil fuel extraction, the use of even immigrant labor. You got to see what they're doing to our brothers and sisters who are working in oil and gas now. They've all shifted, the folks who are working at the most dangerous areas, they've all shifted, and now they look indigenous, they look like they're from other countries, and these are the folks putting the pipes together. These are the folks who are not being paid fair wages. These are the folks being put in harm's way. This is an economic system that has exploited labor for generations. And this exploitation, rooted in profit making, is disrespectful. And those of us who know and understand what honor and virtue and values are, we have to stand up and fight. And we don't have time to convince people that climate change is real. What we know in South Louisiana is that we're already moving. In a place where I live in St. Tammany Parish, we are already seeing massive amounts of people relocating. They're calling this climate migration. There are already people migrating. There are folks, part of the line that's happening across the border coming from Guatemala, from climate disasters, trying to get out of harm's way. This is already happening. And so what we're focused on is making sure that Black folks understand what's happening to them. We're also focusing in on how we connect with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, our Latino brothers and sisters, to say, if the brown folk get together on this and stand up for the value and the soul of this nation, we can win this thing. And it's not just about shaming. It's about coming up with creative and new ideas that are rooted in the traditions that have survived. And that are the traditions of Africa, the traditions of Turtle Island. And that's what we need to be uplifting. This is about us building power. Power from a love place, not from fear, power from love. Yeah.
Such a win-win. God, I love how you articulated, Colette. Thank you. Joseph, can you talk about the connection between fossil fuels, climate, and Indigenous sovereignty?
I have to first say, Wopila Tanka, Miss Colette. You put it beautifully, because that is really the truth. In us gathering our strength, in our culture, in our respect for the land, our respect for one another, our respect for all of our relatives. When we say Mitakuye Oyase, we mean all of our relatives, those that fly, swim, crawl, walk. Those are all of our relatives, and we need to come in balance with the world if our children are going to live. That is Indigenous sovereignty, from North America through to South America. The racism and the extraction that has occurred from not just here in the United States, but what occurred in Africa, in taking the resources from Africa, enriching those Western European countries, began a system of extraction and greed and capitalization that moved over here. And so these practices were well formed and rooted when they came here. So these systems they had a growing place, and then over here they were perfected. So now we're looking at this, and we have to look at this with clear eyes and respect. And I'm so happy you said that, because respect is the basis in which we can move forward. We don't intend to create a place and a system that has revenge or takes revenge or fear, make people live in fear. We've been through that. My parents, our relatives, your parents, all of our relatives have come from a place where we've experienced something like that. And we don't wish to do that, because we know the harm that the generational trauma that we live within our genes. These are places that we in our cultures know that is not a place to grow and move forward in. We want to live without having to deal with policies and redlining and being told that you can't live the culture that respects the earth for your children's sake. it's very important that that message come through as we build and develop these systems, as we talk to folks who seem in opposition to us, who are looking to hold on to these systems of wealth and power. You know, it's not just oil and coal, it's also cattle. When we take a look at the whole breadth and step of everything, what is causing these emissions that give us this this danger that we're all facing as humanity? It's not no longer just, you know, guys over here are facing it over there. We're facing it as a world, and we have to look at it through that lens. So I appreciate so much this conversation, and my sister, Miss Colette, and you, Miss Jane, and Tim, in this as we move forward in this discussion. That's Indigenous, and that's the way that we look at things as Indigenous nations, you know, with respect primarily. So when we look at climate, the injustices that occurred upon us, it's from above, below, left, right, front, and back. It's happened to Indigenous people.
Yeah.
All of my relatives and my ancestors were slaughtered. You know, so us to remain, of the 2% Indigenous people that remain, is the example of the genocide that occurred here. We have to look at that and be honest about it, and move forward with respect. So
one of my favorite quotes of your ancestor, Chief Sitting Bull said, talking about white settlers, the love of possession is a disease with them. I guess that's what you call capitalism, right? Mm-hmm. And I just want to say one thing about cows, because you mentioned cattle. You know, it's not the fault of the cows. It's the fault of the way we raise and manage cattle, cramming them all into small places. When cows are allowed to graze in pasture, you know, move around, they're just fine. I mean, they don't really belong in North America. Bison do, but it's not the cow's fault. It's capitalism's fault.
Yeah, it's going back to the respect of life. You know, we put a species in and restrict them in their life. They have no joy in their lives. And for pigs, cows, chickens, you know, all of these things. And I'm not trying to be pro-agenda on one way, but what I'm saying is that when we ignore a creature's suffering, then we are the oppressor. When we continue to support those systems, we are the oppressors. We have to take an honest look at ourselves and move forward and see each other for this, you know, not just as human beings, but the world. If we don't come to that realization and recognize that, then everything we're doing is going to move ahead, but not as well as it could be for our children's sake. So it's important for us to clear this away from our eyes and see this for what it is. It's respect coming down to that. And we all have a way of looking at respect from where we come from. And that's the jumping point. That's our common place to move ahead. I want to ask Colette a question. One of the things, Colette, that you work on is energy democracy. Would you explain what that is and what you're working on in the Gulf South so far?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting concept to me. It took me going through the recovery of Hurricane Katrina, the recovery of the BP oil drilling disaster 5 years later, to really kind of connect the dots with the consequences of our energy system rooted in our economic system. And what has been very clear in the 15 years since Katrina is that we, and when I say we, I mean Black cities, Black spaces, New Orleans, Memphis, Birmingham, we have what's called the highest energy burden. So these places with a concentration of Black populations pay the most out of their paychecks on energy than other places. And so it's called an energy burden. And so when you look at the energy burden, and then you look at the impact of extractive energy, you see we're getting, as Joseph just said, hit from all sides. Not only are we getting the worst part of the storm, but when there is no storm, our energy bills, we're paying more for our energy bills. And so this gets me to two thoughts. One, after Hurricane Katrina, we didn't have access to electricity. And in some places across the Gulf, the electricity didn't come back on for months. As I mentioned, I'm in Puerto Rico right now. I know my brothers and sisters here know that reality. It was even years, a year in some places in Puerto Rico. But why not? If we have access to the sun and we have access to the wind, which, by the way, let me tell you, South Louisiana, we got a lot of sun. If we have access to these things, why aren't our lights on? right after the storm. The truth is, the fight for renewable energy isn't about just shifting the economy from one rich person to another. This fight for renewable energy has to be part of a broader fight for energy democracy, which says we all are part of this globe, this planet. The sunshine, the water, even the oil under the ground is actually part of the commons, and we all should have not just access to it, but a collective responsibility to steward it. And energy democracy says we've got to be able to have access to our own solar, wind, very clean energy that is sourced from a just place, because we got to watch these solar panels now. They're extracting from other places. They're wreaking havoc. Same thing with our cell phones. We think we're not part of the problem, but we are. We've got to have justly sourced renewable energy resources. And then they have to be controlled by the community. We should not have private energy companies. We should not even have private oil and gas companies. These are the commons. Maybe we should pay some sort of price for some sort of management of a thing, but they should not own what is collectively ours. Energy democracy says we should have community control of our energy. We should have community control of our water. We should have community control of these things. And what's happening right now, especially in the aftermath of disaster, and when I say disaster, I mean Katrina and Flint and everything in between, is we see these emergency manager laws and emergencies that are used to declare the need to accelerate and privatize your water and your sunshine. Mm-hmm. You actually now have to pay money to use the sun rays. You hear what I'm saying to you? Use the sun rays. I got to pay you to use the sun? No, right. We have to fight for a more collective process. And energy democracy says, this is all ours. It's all ours to manage. And if someone has caused harm, i.e. these companies that are polluting, despite all of the science reports and everything that says stop doing it, then they are accountable to clean it up. And we are accountable to practice this thing called democracy. So this is a shout out to the folks who are listening in from the US. We don't just get to watch people handle our energy for us. We got to get in there. It's time for us to understand that democracy is something you have to manage and upkeep. You don't just do it every 4 years. You've got to get in there. City council.
It's not a spectator sport.
This is not a spectator sport for somebody else to do for you. You got to manage this thing. This great, beautiful country of ours means we've got to get in there and help to manage it. So we're talking about community control of our resources, especially sun and wind, as we go into this new economy. This should be democratized, open for everyone, and everyone has a responsibility to manage and steward it.
That's the way.
I just knew you'd have something passionate to say on that. That was wonderful. Tim, what can Joe Biden and Congress do to end fossil fuel racism?
Well, I hope they will definitely check out the Red, Black, and Green New Deal. And I also hope, that they hear from a lot of people. I think that we need to be really loud. This is a moment when a lot can change, but our leaders are going to need a big push from people all across the United States. I think for starters, one thing when you're in the bottom of a hole is to stop digging. And one thing they can do is end fossil fuel subsidies. We should stop giving tax breaks to the corporations that are polluting these communities and wrecking the climate. So that's something that can happen in the next budget bill if there's a loud outcry from the people. But in general, what we need to do is a phase out of fossil fuels at the same time as we build out the more democratic economy that we want to see. And this involves making sure that we address these hotspots of pollution in some of these communities that have been suffering from pollution for decades, while at the same time making sure that workers and communities have a transition to the clean energy that leaves them off better. So we want to make sure that, because we have to build so much stuff, we want to make sure those jobs are union jobs. We want to make sure that communities that are dependent on oil and gas extraction have, the support they need to actually, thrive in the future. So, there's a lot of great things that you'll find on the Red, Black, and Green New Deal website and in the report we put out. But I think, a phase out of fossil fuels and investing in the future we want to see that ensures that there's justice for communities and workers is really the main framework.
Thank you, Tim, for that. And before we go to audience questions, besides Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us, I want to recommend another one. I'm sure that Colette will agree. It's by Arlie Hochschild, called Strangers in Their Own Land. Strangers in Their Own Land. It's about the Gulf South and Louisiana, and it's really worth a read. And now, Maddie, let's take some audience questions.
Absolutely. So the first question is from Carlota on Zoom, and it's for you, Colette. Obviously, the response to Hurricane Katrina exposed many layers of systemic racism in our government. What systems can we invest in that will do a better job responding to emergencies? Is there a place for FEMA?
I have some ideas where FEMA could go, but I respect Jane Fonda too much to tell you the answer to that question. But I will say thank you for that question. I do think all of us need to be paying attention to what's called the Stafford Act. And that is the federal law that goes into effect during emergency. And right now, and I've heard it directly from the FEMA director's mouth, that law, those laws are actually made for the middle class. And what that means in places like the South, where you have a disproportionate number of people who live below the poverty line, which, by the way, is a legacy of slavery. Let's be honest about what we're seeing here. When you have those many people living below the poverty line, you have to understand that disasters that come there and the federal response to them will not be adequate, and in fact aren't even made for them. So one thing that I'd love to see advocacy around is really around the Stafford Act. And I also have to say the racism and the discrimination that I saw in disaster was widespread. This was something I didn't know. Housing, education, healthcare. I don't know anything about this stuff, but every single place we turned when you go through a disaster like that had some barrier for Black or poor or Indigenous or queer or trans folks and immigrant folks. This is what we have to combat. If we're facing climate change and we know we're going to see more disasters, we have to shift, transform our disaster response and recovery laws, because right now they're not good enough. The other thing I would mention is, as Tim was talking about, this transition of our economic system away from things that harm us toward things that help us to thrive, is to really look at the question that's being posed to folks. Choosing the earth over your jobs, choosing the environment over your jobs. This is a false choice, and we need as many people screaming from the rooftops that this is not real. And as we just heard Jane speaking about this transition, people in Louisiana have the skills. They're welders, they're pipe fitters, they work on these rigs. Do you know what else they work on? Wind turbines. We just don't have the political will to put the wind turbines in the red block of the South. They're going to Rhode Island, they're going to Massachusetts, they're going to other countries. We've got to see this administration put the people who are going to transition out of one industry into another. We need a recovery fund. We need an Office of Just Transition at the federal level and at the state level. We need support for these workers to be able to make that transition, and then pay people livable wages so they can take care of their families and take care of their health. These are just some ideas, and we'd like to invite you to check out the Red, Black, and Green New Deal for more of those ideas coming from the front lines.
Hear, hear.
Ms. Jane, can I hop in?
Yeah, Joseph, yes.
One thing we are doing to address that here at Standing Rock, after our whole issue with the pipeline fight, is build our own energy system. And we did that in a community-driven way. Our council formed a Section 17. We're crowdsource funding this thing so that we have more ownership as a community of it, which means we have more revenue. And that revenue will go to serve not just putting up our first wind farm, but a second wind farm. And we're doing it in a respectful way. We're protecting sacred sites. We're protecting all of our relatives in Mitakuye Oyasin. So we're having that level of respect as we're building this. And these are going to go back to serve our community-driven goals, to take care of our people. And so this is something that in this way, we're looking to give this model to every other community out there that can do that and garner their own resources and collectivize themselves, be that collective that can serve community needs, not profit needs. So the regulatory system that's out there, the net metering positions that some regulatory agencies and states have, need to change so the communities can have more power in it being self-determinative. So see what we're doing at petui.com and Sage Development Authority, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe. We're looking to do this and work and give this model out to everyone that can help themselves and want to help themselves. So it's a beautiful thing, and I so want to get with Colette and get down there and, start making these connections between Black and Brown, because it's important. Indigenous people are North, Central, South America. There's no line, there's no Mexican, there's no Honduran, there's none of that. We were all Indigenous. The border crossed us. We never crossed the border, and that still continues. This categorization and separation and racism is an artificial thing built to compartmentalize and take away power. Unity is what the fear is, fear of the unity of the Black and Brown. And like I said before, we don't mean to hurt anybody. We just mean to live in a way that protects this world for our children. So justice.
I just want to say, you mentioned that it's crowd-funded, it's crowdsourced.
Yep.
And the information about how to help out is in the chat room for everybody.
Thank you, Ms. Jane. Yeah.
Thank you, Joseph. Next question, Maddie.
From Jimmy on Facebook, and this one is for you, Tim. This year's fire season here in California is supposed to be the worst one yet, and it's already started. Between power blackouts and evacuations, how do you think fossil fuel racism plays a role, and what can we do?
Well, as a Californian, I think that's a fantastic question. You know, folks who live in California know the last several years we've had really awful fire seasons that destroyed communities and have covered the state in smoke. That, that the smoke is particulate matter as well. It causes people to have premature death, to have asthma, to have all these health problems. And, I think one thing that a lot of groups, environmental justice groups in California have been doing is calling on Governor Newsom, really, that this is a wake-up call for the state, that we need to really end fossil fuel extraction in California. And he's taken some steps, he's put a deadline for phase out of fossil fuels, which is historic on one sense, but it's also by 2045, which is not soon enough. That California really does need to be a leader on this, and that this is a state where we can take some really aggressive steps to phase out fossil fuels. I mean, we have oil wells in the second largest city in the country, in Los Angeles, that are just short distances from people's homes. This is a place where these harms, these healthcare harms from oil and gas extraction are really visibly really harmful. So there's so much that the Governor Newsom can do, and folks should check out the Last Chance Alliance that has a really great campaign that they're pushing the governor on to really take action against phasing out and ensuring a just transition in California.
Thanks, Tim. And this has been such an active and wild and wonderful panel, and that the time has just run out. So I'm afraid we can't take any more audience questions. For those of you who want to watch the program again or recommend it to others, you can go to our website or you can go to YouTube a little bit later, but we're there in perpetuity. You can find us. Thank you to my wonderful guests today for the important conversation and for all the incredible and brave work you do. And if you haven't already, be sure to read the Fossil Fuel Racism Report, authored by Tim and Colette. We're going to drop the link into the chat box. Colette shared a lot about what's happening in the Gulf and what's at stake as communities there prepare for hurricane season. And we're going to continue this conversation this coming Thursday, May 27th, 5 o'clock Pacific time with Spike Lee. Please, you go to firedrillfriday.com/movie night to sign up. And as you know, here on Fire Drill Friday, we are laser focused on getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, it's just, I don't know, it's unthinkable, it's unacceptable to keep giving billions of taxpayer dollars to people that are killing us and creating climate chaos. We have to stop it. Congress is preparing to go on recess in a few weeks. They're going home. This is the chance for every single one of us to virtually meet with our representatives, or maybe we can even go to their offices and let them know that their top priority should be immediately ending fossil fuel subsidies and leading the way to a Green New Style recovery.
Oh.
Okay, make your voice heard by setting up a meeting with your representative during the coming recess, June 1st through 4th. This is one of the most powerful ways that you can influence your member of Congress. And if you've never done it before, don't worry, we'll provide a toolkit with everything you need and follow-up to provide personal one-on-one coaching to ensure that you are fully prepared every step of the way. You know the drill. To make change, you got to take action. So head over to firedrillfriday.com/take action, and you'll see the link on how to sign up and hold a lobby meeting with your representative and tell them to put people and planet over profit. And on a final note, a year ago this week, we all witnessed the horror of George Floyd's murder. A horror that has been a reality in communities of color for a very, very long time. And we've discussed at length today the poisonous tendrils of racism stretch through this country's history and continue their stranglehold on our politics and institutions. It is our moral imperative to put an end to systematic racism in the fossil fuel industry and every single place it manifests. I hope you all have a good week. I hope that you will join us for movie night and for next week's Fire Drill Friday, where my guest will be Demi Lovato. That's exciting.
Can I be on that one too?
Stay safe and in community. I love you for joining us. See you next time.